Module 23. Aquatint Sugar Salt Spray. Carefully choose one zinc, copper, iron block and ensure that the block chosen is cut at right angles of 7 inches into 7 inches in size. The design to be printed has to be of the same dimensions as the size of the block, that is 7 inches into 7 inches. Prepare several sketches to refine the design and select one for printing. Slope the edges of the entire block using a metal file. This technique is called beveling the block edges. Carefully polish the surface to be etched clean with brass. History and introduction. Aquatint is a printmaking technique of the intaglio printing family technique, a slight variation of etching. In intaglio printmaking, the artist makes marks on the plate, in the case of Aquatint a copper or zinc plate, that are capable of holding ink. The inked place is passed through a printing press together with a sheet of paper, resulting in a transfer of the ink to the paper. This can be repeated a number of times depending on the particular technique. Degrease the block. This is carried out by cleaning the entire block with soap. Aquatint also uses the application of a mordant or acid solution to etch into the metal plate. Where the engraving technique uses a needle to make lines that print in black or whatever color ink is used, Aquatint uses powder rosin to create a tonal effect. The rosin is acid resistant and typically adhered to the plate by controlled heating. The tonal variation is controlled by the level of mordant exposure over large areas, and thus the image is shaped by large sections at a time. This technique was invented by the painter and printmaker Jan van de Velde IV in Amsterdam around 1650. Aquatint is widely used by printmakers to achieve broad range of tonal effect. The process is called aquatint because finished prints often resemble watercolor drawings or wash drawings. The technique consists of exposing a copper plate to acid through a layer of melted granulated resin. Sometimes the choice of plate can vary from copper to zinc and iron, however the process is generally similar. In the 17th century, a number of attempts were made at producing what later becomes known as aquatint prints. None of the efforts was successful, however, until 1768, when the French printmaker Jean-Baptiste Leprince discovered that granulated resin gave satisfactory results. Aquatint became the most popular method of producing tone prints in the late 18th century, especially among illustrators. Its textural versatility, however, remained largely unexplored by well-known artists except for Francisco de Goya. Most of his prints are aquatints, and he is considered the greatest master of the technique. Next, this clean block is applied with hard ground and smoked on the side to be etched. After Goya's death, Aquatint was largely ignored until Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, and Mary Cassatt together began to revive it by experimenting with it. Within Aquatint itself, a few new innovations began to come out, like sugar Aquatint, sometimes called sugar lift, was another method that came into widespread use in the 20th century, owing to the work of artists such as Pablo Picasso and Georges Rouault. Many contemporary printmakers also use pressurized plastic spray in place of resin. After earlier, bolder aquatints, the process was predominantly used for giving the impression of watercolor wash and building up gradations of tone with etching line drawing. Aquatints produced effective copies of watercolor washes which were popular at the time and were often used in color plate books in the late 18th century and early 19th centuries. Draw or trace the design or sketch on the block. This sketch can be further improved at the time of the final drawing on the block. The aquatint process involves spreading a ground dissolved in liquid over a plate, traditionally copper or zinc, which once the liquid has evaporated leaving the ground acts as resist to an acid which is applied. The acid bites into the exposed plate leaving a soft grain which can be varied by using the acid to bite to different depths. It is normally combined with etching to provide the outline, as aquatint cannot produce a line. The laying of the aquatint grain was often entrusted to a specialist by the late 18th century, and there were various methods including using a dust box to blow the ground, which then settled into an even layer on the plate, and dissolving the ground in alcohol, which then evaporated leaving the ground behind. Now draw the image on the block with the help of pointed etching, needle or tools with light pressure. The design on the plate would be produced in negative. So in order to reverse it, a sugar lift technique can be used. The design is brushed onto the plate with sugar liquid and is then covered with a chopping out varnish and immersed in water. The sugar swells and lifts the varnish, leaving the design in bare copper. It is then covered with an aquatint grain as normal. Some of the best experiments on sugar lift aquatints were made in recent times by printmaker Andrew Baldwin. These experiments use icing sugar to create an aquatint. Using an aquatint box, icing sugar becomes embedded into the ground after it is blown throughout the box using a hair dryer or settles onto the plate. The aquatint box has a tray suspended several inches from the top of the box on which the sieved sugar is placed under a hole which the hair dryer fits into. A grounded plate is centered on the bottom of the Aquatint box underneath the suspended tray. After some duration, the plate was then taken out of the Aquatint box and put in the baking oven to sit for 30 minutes so that no dust would get onto the ground. After 40 minutes, the sugar on the plate does not appear to have dissolved. More so, the plate was baked in the oven for 6 minutes and allowed to sit after baking was complete. Analysis of the plate shows a mottled, uneven texture. When the ground is hardened in such way, the plate is submerged into hot water to dissolve the sugar. The back side of the block to be etched is first covered with an acid-resistant coat, either of black Japan or plastic sticker. At first, nearly boiling water is used for submersion while constantly agitating the water, taken out, dried with newspaper. The plate is again submerged for 2 minutes in nearly boiling hot water and process is repeated. The processes create a smooth, even aquatint that can be used in intaglio printmaking. Francisco de Goya. Born in Spain on 30th March 1746, artist Francisco de Goya was a painter and prolific printmaker of his times. He is considered one of the biggest influences and contributors to the field of printmaking in the last 18th and early 19th century. He became a court painter of the Spanish crown in 1786, and the early portion of his career is marked by portraits commissioned by the Spanish aristocracy and royalty, as well as the Rococo style tapestry cartoons designed for the royal palace. Goya was a guarded man, and although letters and writings survived, he was comparatively little about his thoughts. He suffered a severe and undiagnosed illness in 1793, which left him completely deaf. After 1793, his work became progressively darker and pessimistic. His later easel and mural prints and drawings appear to reflect a bleak outlook on personal, social, and political levels, and contrast with his social climbing. The block is now to be etched using a nitric acid, 60% purity solution. This is the Etching solution. To prepare the etchant, mix carefully 1 part nitric acid with 10 parts water in a plastic tray. Gently and carefully, while wearing gloves, place the block in the acid solution, which is the etchant. The etchant to be used is nitric acid of 60% purity mixed with 14 parts of the water. This nitric acid solution is the etchant coat in the plastic tray. Now gently and carefully place the acid solution in the plastic tray. It should be noted that for a normal edged line, the duration of soaking the block in acid is 25 minutes. There is a possibility of air bubbles forming during the etching process, hence it is imperative one removes them using a feather or other such object the time the block is being etched. After the block is etched, clean the surface with kerosene and put the sugar and then heat the block till the sugar melts. He was appointed Director of the Royal Academy in 1795, the year Manuel Godoy made an unfavorable treaty with France. Italy at the time was the cultural capital of Europe and held all the prototypes of classical antiquity, while Spain lacked a coherent artistic direction with all of its significant visual achievements in the past. Having failed to earn a scholarship, Goya relocated at his own expense to Rome in the old tradition of European artists, stretching back to at least to Albrecht Dürer. He studied with the Aragonese artist Francisco Bayeu y Subias, and his paintings began to show signs of the delicate tonalities for which he became famous. Goya befriended Francisco Bayeu and married Bayeu's sister Josefa. He nicknamed her Pipa. The marriage and Francisco Bayeu's 1765 membership of the Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando and directorship of the tapestry works from 1777 helped Goya earn a commission for a series of tapestry cartoons for the Royal Tapestry Factory. Over 5 years, he designed some 42 patterns, many of which were used to decorate and insulate the stone walls of El Escorial and the Palacio Real del Pardo, the residences of the Spanish monarchs. While designing tapestries was neither prestigious nor well paid, his cartoons were mostly popularized in Rococo style, and Goya used them to bring himself to wider attention. The cartoons were not his only royal commissions and were accompanied by a series of engravings, mostly occupied after old masters such as Marcantonio Raimondi and Velasquez. Etching became a medium that the young artist was to master, a medium that was to reveal both the true depths of his imagination and his political beliefs. It was one of the first of the Goya's mid-1790s cabinets paintings in which his earlier series of ideal beauty gave way to an examination for the relationship between naturalism and fantasy that would preoccupy him for the rest of his career. He was undergoing a nervous breakdown and entering prolonged physical illness and admitted that the series was created to reflect his own self-doubt, anxiety, and fear that he himself was going mad. Goya wrote that the works serve to occupy my imagination, tormented as it is by contemplation of my suffering. The series, he said, consisted of pictures which normally find no place in commissioned works. Although he did not make known his intention when creating the Aquatint plates of the disasters of war in the 1810s, art historians view them as a visual protest against the violence of the 1808 Dos de Mayo uprising, the subsequent Peninsular War, and the setbacks to the liberal cause following the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in 1814. The scenes are singularly disturbing, sometimes macabre in their depiction of the battlefield horror, and represent an outrage conscience in the face of death and destruction. Apply the liquid hard ground using a brush and put some salt powder as per design requirements before the hard ground dries out. They were not published until 1863, 35 years after his death. It is likely that only then was it considered politically safe to distribute a sequence of artworks criticizing both the French and restored Bourbons. The first 47 plates in the series focus on incidents from the war and show the consequence of the conflicts on individual soldiers and civilians. The middle series, plates 48 to 64, record the effects of the famine that hit Madrid in 1811 to 12, before the city was liberated from the French. The final 17 reflect the bitter disappointment of liberals when the restored Bourbon monarchy, encouraged by the Catholic hierarchy, rejected the Spanish Constitution of 1812 and opposed both states and religious reform. The Block in Goya had been a successful and royally placed artist, but withdrew from public life during his final years. From the late 1810s, he lived in near solitude outside Madrid in a frame house converted into a studio. The house had become known as La Quinta del Sordo, the house of the deaf man, after the nearest frame house had coincidentally also belonged to a deaf man. Understanding the process by which an etching is made is invaluable in appreciating Francisco Goya's supreme mastery of his difficult medium. The processes Goya used to prepare the plates for the Disaster of War print series are broadly categorized as intaglio, a general term for the type of printmaking in which the lines carved into a metal plate are the same lines that later hold and print ink, as opposed to relief processes, such as woodcut, in which the parts of the plate that hold ink are those parts left untouched. Slowly block clean by warm water, sugar and salt will melt and clean by water. Viewing the disasters leaves no doubt that the methods Goya used were complicated and required a number of tools to render the varied effects in his prints. In fact, Goya combined several specific methods of etching and Aquatint to achieve the rich lineal and tonal qualities we see in his prints. Some of these methods were old ones that had been mastered by many artists before Goya's lifetime, while others marked innovations in printmaking that were being pioneered at the turn of the 19th century while Goya was creating the disasters of war. In order to etch a copper plate, the artist must first coat the plate with a thin layer of acid-resistant ground. The artist scratches lines into this ground, exposing the copper underneath. The plate is then placed into an acid solution which bites the unprotected copper, the lines that the artist has exposed, into grooves deep enough to hold ink. Edged lines are very clean because the acid removes exactly those parts of the plate where the ground has been scratched away. The back side of the block to be etched is first covered with an acid-resistant coat, either of black Japan or a plastic sticker. Etching is also the word most generally used to describe intaglio prints, even when other processes are used to create the image. Goya's prints are referred to as etchings, although he did much more to his plates than just etch them. Aquatint emerged as a printmaking process during Goya's lifetime. Now the block is ready to be etched. To create an aquatint surface on a plate, the artist first applies fine particles of acid-resistant resin to the plate. This is usually done in one of the two ways, with a resin powder which is allowed to settle on the plate and then melted onto it, or with an alcohol solution which evaporates from the plate, leaving a layer of resin spread evenly, or deliberately unevenly, as in some of Goya's prints, over those areas of the plates where the solution was brushed or sprayed. After applying his layer of resin to the plate, the artist places it into an acid solution, which bites the plate in the areas unprotected by resin. In other words, an even coat of resins allowed the acid to chemically etch the plate evenly in the aquatint area, which then prints as a field of value or tone. Aquatint was an innovation in printmaking because it had previously been possible to create only linear pattern on prints. Fields of value could be created only through hashed lines, a buildup of fine lines that create the illusion of a smooth tone. Aquatint added the element of tone to prints, an element that adds to the extraordinary quality of the disasters of war. It is common to print a fairly large number of prints, a practice known as additioning. Multiple copies of single prints, or as in Goya's case, multiple copies of a series of prints, are made to be sold or distributed to different collectors, galleries, and museums. The disasters of war plates were shield-faced after a large edition was printed in 1863. Shield facing helped make it possible to publish later smaller editions of the disasters of war without further damaging these valuable plates. There are 485 working proofs from the disasters of war. One might speculate that so many proofs from the series exist because Goya worked on it for over a decade and because he never published a finished edition in his lifetime. The proofs would have been his main references as he worked on the series. The last copy that Goya produced was a set of 85 working proofs that he gave his friend Keen Bermudez, who he hoped would correct the captions penciled in the lower margin. The original copper plates from which the Bermudez proofs were pulled, along with some preliminary drawing and other proofs, remained in Goya's family until between 1854 and 1862, when they were sold to various collectors throughout Europe. In 1862, the Academy of San Fernando purchased the original plates. The plates reached the Academy largely in good condition. However, some of the plates, numbers 13, 14, 15, and 30, which Goya had etched during the war, were of inferior quality and needed minor repairs. The Academy applied Aquatint and burnished these damaged plates. Around the same time, Keen Bermudez's daughter presented the set of working proofs with captions to master printer Valentin Cardrera, who engraved the corrected captions. These finalized plates were the source of all subsequent editions of Disasters of War. Printmaking played a vital role in Goya's artistic career. He began his study of the medium as part of his academic training at a time when it was conventional for aspiring artists to etch copies of famous paintings as a form of practice. Goya also owned a few prints, including some by the great 17th and 18th century etchers Rembrandt van Rijn and Giovanni Battista Piranesi. Goya etched over 300 plates in his career. One of Goya's earliest original prints, The Garroted Man, illustrating an execution method sometimes used by the Inquisition, stands in stark contrast to the commissioned paintings Goya was producing at the time. This print set a tone of direct social critique that he would develop further in several series of prints, including the Capricos, Disperates, and Tauromaquia. The Disasters of War, along with these other series, was an uncommissioned work that reflects Goya's personal response to troubles plaguing Spanish society at the time. Francisco de Goya passed away on 16th April 1828. Health and safety precautions. 1. Store concentrated nitric acid and potassium chloride separately from other chemicals. Whenever possible, use diluted acid. Acid etching should be done with local exhaust ventilation. Second, an important safety rule when diluting concentrated acids is to add the acid to the water, never the reverse. Third, wear appropriate gloves, goggles, and protective aprons or lab coats when handling acids. If acid is spilled on your skin, wash with lots of water. In case of eye contact, rinse the eyes with water for at least 15 to 20 minutes and seek medical attention. 4. Cover acid baths when not in use. 5th, nitric acid etching releases the respiratory irritant nitrogen dioxide, which has poor odor warning properties. During the etching processes, flammable hydrogen gas is also produced. Concentrated nitric acid is a strong oxidizing agent and can react with many other chemicals, especially solvents or other organic compounds, to cause a fire. 6. Concentrated acids are corrosive to skin, eyes, respiratory system, and gastrointestinal system. Dilute acids can cause skin irritation on repeated or prolonged contact. Concentrated nitric acid is a strong oxidizing agent and can react explosively with other concentrated acids, solvents, etc. Nitric acid gives off various nitrogen oxide gases, including nitrogen dioxide, which is a strong lung irritant and can cause emphysema. 7. Always work in a well-ventilated area. If in a closed space, keep the windows open at all times. 8. Read the safety, handling instructions and caution labels on nitric acid bottles and containers carefully. 9. Always wear acid-resistant gloves, safety goggles, apron, and respirator while handling acids. 10th, in the case of an accident or your need for assistance, make sure someone else in the room is aware of what you are doing. 11. Should the add solution splash or come in contact with skin and is allowed to remain in contact with skin, the result will be a severe burn. It can be washed off immediately with plenty of water and follow these general guidelines. Always keep a container of cold water nearby in cases of an accident. If your skin comes in contact with the acid, wash the area immediately with plenty of cold water and soap for a minimum of 15 minutes. Get a medical attention. 12. If your body should come in contact with the acid, wash your entire body with the hose from the draining sink for a minimum of 15 minutes. Get immediate medical attention. 16. Mordants, acids, and inks can be water-based or solvent-based, and hence care has to be taken that if a student has any respiratory allergies, asthma problems, appropriate aeration is provided. 14. Etching needles and tools should be stored safely and one should always cut away from yourself. In advance, locate the nearest first aid box. 15. When possible, clamp down plates to avoid slippage. Minimize the chance of carpal tunnel syndrome by choosing tools with wide handles, avoiding tight grips, and including hand flexing exercises during regular test periods. Set work table height so wrist flexing motions are minimal. 16. Sharp metallic tools for techniques like dry point, etching, engraving, and mezzotint have to be used carefully and with a firm hand. Keep sharp tools under lock and key.